What if the most dangerous threat to the monarchy right now isn't protest, politics, or public opinion, but a rumor the palace cannot publicly address? Not a headline confirmed on the record, not a press release stamped with royal crests, but a whisper, a question, a claim that, true or not, carries consequences so severe that silence becomes the only strategy. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because in the world of royalty, some rumors are treated as gossip, and some are treated as existential threats. And according to multiple media observers, insiders, and legal analysts, this one, the allegation that private DNA findings could complicate Prince Harry's family line, belongs firmly in the second category. Now, to be clear from the very beginning, there is no publicly released DNA report, no official confirmation. No on-record acknowledgement from the palace, from Prince Harry, from Meghan Markle, or from any legal authority. But that's precisely what makes this story so volatile. Because when a rumor is false, institutions deny it. When it's harmless, they ignore it. But when a rumor could destabilize inheritance structures, succession logic, and decades-old legal frameworks, that's when things start happening quietly, quickly, and out of sight. And that's why, according to widespread online speculation and media analysis over the past few hours, the sudden narrative that Prince William may have moved to freeze aspects of Prince Harry's inheritance, even temporarily, has set off a frenzy of questions that refuse to go away. Not because anyone has proven anything, but because the palace hasn't rushed to shut it down. So let's slow this down. Let's strip away the clickbait phrasing, the sensational thumbnails, the shouting headlines, and ask a calmer but far more dangerous question. Why would the idea of a DNA rumor alone be enough to make the monarchy nervous? And why would inheritance, not titles, not public roles, not ceremonies, be the first thing people believe could be quietly paused? To understand that, we have to understand how the royal system actually works behind the scenes. Because the public version of royalty is about love stories, weddings, children, and smiling photographs on palace balconies. But the private version is about bloodlines, documentation, contingency planning, and risk management. And that's where the story truly begins. Over the past several years, Prince Harry's departure from royal duties has been framed as emotional, personal, and ideological. A man stepping away from an institution he felt no longer protected him or his family. But institutions don't stop functioning just because someone leaves. Trusts remain active, legal frameworks remain intact, inheritance plans, especially those created generations ago, don't evaporate with distance or dissent. They wait. And according to analysts who follow royal finances closely, many of these arrangements are not symbolic gestures of affection. They are legal instruments with clauses, conditions, and safeguards that the public never sees. Which brings us to the rumor that exploded seemingly out of nowhere. A rumor suggesting that private DNA verification, not conducted publicly, not acknowledged officially, could complicate assumptions about lineage. Again, not confirmed, not proven, not validated, but powerful enough as a hypothetical to trigger something far more revealing than confirmation ever could: defensive preparation. Ask yourself this. If a rumor like this were completely absurd, completely baseless, completely impossible, what would the palace do? They would deny it, quickly, firmly, unequivocally. Instead, what the public has seen, at least so far, is nothing. No statement, no clarification, no legal threat issued publicly against those spreading the claim. Just silence. And silence, in royal terms, is never accidental. Now let's talk about Prince William's role in this narrative, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as an institutional actor. As the Prince of Wales, William is not just a brother. He is a custodian in training, a future monarch whose primary responsibility is not harmony, but stability. That distinction matters, because if an allegation emerges, even a false one, that could one day be weaponized legally, politically, or financially against the crown, ignoring it would be reckless, especially when inheritance is involved. Royal inheritance is not a single pot of money handed down with a smile and a hug. It's a web of private trusts, old wills, discretionary powers and conditional arrangements established long before today's headlines. Some of those arrangements are automatic, others require oversight, and some, according to legal experts, can be paused or reviewed if questions arise that could later result in litigation. That's why the idea of a temporary freeze, again alleged, unconfirmed, speculative, has captured so much attention. Because freezing something doesn't mean declaring guilt. It means buying time. Time to assess risk. Time to consult lawyers. Time to prevent irreversible consequences while facts, or rumors, swirl. So the real question isn't whether the DNA allegation is true. The real question is this: what would the monarchy do if it didn't know yet? And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because the monarchy has faced lineage crises before, illegitimacy rumors, succession disputes, questions about heirs, in some cases, these questions reshaped entire reigns. History teaches the institution one lesson over and over again: deal with bloodline uncertainty early or pay for it later, publicly and painfully. Which brings us to Archie, a child who, in the public eye, represents a modern multicultural future for the monarchy, a symbol of change, of evolution, of blending tradition with the present. But in private legal frameworks, symbolism carries far less weight than documentation. And that's why even the whisper of a question about lineage becomes radioactive. Not because anyone wants it to be, but because the system demands certainty. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: if you were in charge of protecting an institution that has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and revolutions, would you gamble its future on assuming a rumor would simply disappear? Or would you quietly prepare for every possible outcome? This is where the emotional layer of the story collides with the institutional one. Because on a human level, this narrative is devastating. Imagine being Prince Harry, already estranged, already scrutinized, already carrying the weight of leaving everything behind, and then watching a rumor about your own family ignite global speculation. Even if false, the damage is real. Trust erodes. Old wounds reopen. Every silence feels loaded. And from Meghan Markle's perspective, a woman who has lived under relentless public scrutiny, the idea that even hypothetical claims about her private life could ripple into legal consequences must feel suffocating. But institutions don't operate on empathy alone. They operate on risk. And that's why the story has accelerated so quickly. Because whether the rumor is true, false, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, the consequences of ignoring it could be far worse than the consequences of quietly preparing for it. And that's what makes the next part of this story so explosive. Because according to those watching closely, the inheritance question may not be about money at all. It may be about precedent. Because once you allow uncertainty into a bloodline-based system, everything built on certainty begins to shake. And that's where the palace allegedly finds itself right now, standing between public silence and private alarm. But here's the twist: no one is ready for yet. Because if this rumor were to escalate, not through confirmation, but through continued ambiguity, the next step wouldn't be a press release. It would be legal. And that's where things could change forever. Because once lawyers enter the room, the story stops being emotional and starts being irreversible. But what exactly would trigger that step? And why do some analysts believe the palace is already preparing for it? Because according to sources familiar with royal legal strategy, the inheritance issue may only be the first safeguard, not the last. And if that's true, then what comes next could redefine not just one family, but the future shape of the monarchy itself. And that is where this story is heading next. Section complete. What would make a future king act in the dark? Not metaphorically, literally. Not with speeches, ceremonies, or statements, but with phone calls, documents, and silence. Because according to analysts watching this unfold in real time, the most unsettling detail in this entire saga isn't the rumor itself, it's the timing. Late-night activity, abrupt legal consultations, and a sudden shift in tone among palace watchers who know the difference between routine caution and emergency posture. Here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud, but everyone is thinking, why now? Royal households are not reactive institutions. They are famously slow, deliberate, and insulated. Decisions take weeks, sometimes months, often years. So when speculation emerges that Prince William, as Prince of Wales and primary steward of royal continuity, may have moved swiftly to review or pause aspects of Prince Harry's inheritance framework, people don't assume panic. They assume prevention. Because in royal governance, midnight decisions are not about drama, they're about damage control. Let's walk this carefully. There is no public confirmation that any inheritance has been frozen. No official document has surfaced. No spokesperson has used those words. And yet, the narrative exploded anyway. Why? Because inheritance doesn't move unless someone believes it might soon be challenged. And challenges don't come from headlines, they come from lawyers. Imagine this scenario, not as fact, but as institutional logic. A rumor begins circulating online and in tabloid-adjacent media, suggesting that private DNA verification could complicate assumptions about lineage. The claim is unverified, unattributed, and publicly unacknowledged. On the surface, it looks like noise, but to legal advisors, it's a potential liability signal. Because in the royal system, inheritance arrangements are often conditional, not on morality or popularity, but on legal clarity. And clarity, once questioned, must be restored or contained. So what would a responsible institutional actor do? Not issue a denial that amplifies the rumor, not attack the press and risk discovery processes, not react emotionally. They would quietly assess exposure, which is where the idea of a midnight decision enters the conversation. Royal estates, trusts, and financial vehicles are overseen by a small network of advisors whose job is to anticipate problems before they become public catastrophes. And when those advisors flag a scenario, even a hypothetical one, that could later result in legal dispute, their recommendation is rarely dramatic. It's procedural. Pause discretionary distributions. Review trust language. Confirm documentation. Ensure no irreversible actions occur while uncertainty exists. This is not punishment. This is triage, and that's why, according to multiple legal commentators, the idea of a temporary freeze, again alleged, speculative, makes sense only in one context. Someone believed waiting could be riskier than acting. Now here's where the emotional weight of this chapter deepens, because if such a pause were discussed, it wouldn't be framed as against Prince Harry. It would be framed as for the institution. That distinction matters more than people realize. Prince William is not simply a brother navigating a family disagreement. He is a man being trained, publicly and privately, to place continuity above comfort. History does not forgive monarchs who ignore early warnings. And royal history is littered with examples where silence became scandal because preparation came too late. This is why analysts keep returning to the same uncomfortable possibility. The palace may not believe the rumor, but it may believe the rumor could be used by hostile media, used by political actors, used by future litigants, used by anyone seeking leverage over a system built on legitimacy. And when leverage is possible, lawyers advise caution. So let's talk about the alleged moment itself. Midnight decisions don't always happen at midnight on the clock. They happen at the moment when new information crosses a threshold from interesting to actionable. That could be an internal memo, a legal opinion, a risk assessment circulated among advisors, not a DNA result, but a projection of what could happen if such a claim were ever formally raised. Because here's a detail most people miss. In inheritance law, especially in private trusts, you don't need proof to trigger review. You need plausibility. If a future claimant could argue that trustees failed to act prudently once questions were raised, those trustees become vulnerable. And vulnerability is the one thing the monarchy avoids at all costs. So imagine the internal conversation. Not emotional, not accusatory, but coldly analytical. What if this rumor escalates? What if someone demands disclosure? What if silence is interpreted as negligence? What if funds are distributed now and contested later? Suddenly, doing nothing is the riskiest option of all. This is why observers believe that if any move occurred, it would have been temporary, reversible, and deliberately quiet. No announcement, no confrontation, Just safeguards. But here's where the story becomes deeply human again. Because even hypothetical safeguards carry emotional consequences. If Prince Harry sensed, even indirectly, that inheritance arrangements were under review, the message would land with force, not as legalese, but as distrust. And that's where decades of brotherhood, shared grief, and unresolved tension come rushing back into the frame. Ask yourself this: how would you feel if your own family quietly prepared for a legal scenario that implied uncertainty about your child, even if no one accused you, even if no one said a word publicly? The silence itself would speak volumes. And this is where analysts believe the midnight decision narrative gains emotional traction, because it aligns with a pattern where public calm masks private urgency, where the monarchy doesn't react, it prepares, where decisions aren't explained until history demands explanations, and where brothers become symbols before they can be human again. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because if this chapter is about the decision itself, the next question is inevitable. What exactly triggered the sense of urgency? Because rumors circulate constantly, wild claims rise and fall every week. Most are ignored. So why this one? Why did this particular allegation, unverified, unattributed, hit differently? Some believe it's because it intersected with inheritance timing. Others believe it's because it arrived alongside unrelated legal reviews already underway. And a third camp believes something else entirely, that the palace may have been anticipating a challenge long before the rumor surfaced. Not because of DNA, but because of documentation. Because inheritance is not just about who you are, it's about what can be proven. And that opens a door most people haven't considered yet. What if this story isn't really about a rumor at all? What if it's about vulnerabilities that already existed? Vulnerabilities this rumor merely exposed. Because if that's the case, then the midnight decision wasn't a reaction. It was a contingency plan finally activated. And that leads us directly into the next chapter. Because once inheritance enters the conversation, you're no longer dealing with emotion or narrative. You're dealing with rules. Rules written long before this generation ever existed. Rules that don't care who feels wronged. Rules that only care whether conditions have been met. And once those rules are invoked, the story stops being speculative and starts becoming structural. But what are those rules? And why do they terrify even the most modern monarchy? Because the inheritance system the public imagines is not the one that actually exists. And once you understand that system, everything about this midnight decision begins to make unsettling sense. And that's where we're going next. What if the story everyone is arguing about isn't even the real story? What if the argument about DNA, rumors, and family drama is just the surface noise, while the real issue sits quietly in legal language most people will never read? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When people hear the word inheritance, they imagine a will, a signature, a sum of money passed down out of love or obligation. That image couldn't be further from reality when it comes to royal finances. And this is where everything shifts. Because the monarchy doesn't operate on sentiment, it operates on systems. And those systems were designed not for fairness, but for survival. Let's strip away the myth. Royal inheritance is not one inheritance. It is layers, private trusts, discretionary arrangements, conditional provisions, assets shielded from public scrutiny by centuries of legal insulation. Some of these structures predate modern governments. Others were refined precisely because earlier generations learned painful lessons about disputes, illegitimacy rumors, and legal challenges. And the most important thing to understand is this: most of these arrangements were designed with one core fear in mind: uncertainty. Because uncertainty is poison to an institution that survives on legitimacy. That's why, according to legal historians, royal inheritance frameworks are obsessed with documentation, clarity, and contingency planning. Not love, not loyalty, not even blood in the emotional sense, but proof. Which brings us back to why the rumor, even as speculation, matters. Because these systems don't wait for confirmation to activate safeguards. They respond to risk. Here's a detail rarely discussed outside legal circles. Many royal trusts are discretionary. not automatic. That means distributions can be delayed, paused, or restructured if trustees believe circumstances warrant review. And circumstances doesn't mean scandal. It means ambiguity. If there is a plausible scenario in which an asset distribution could later be challenged, trustees are not just allowed to slow things down, they are expected to, because failing to do so exposes them and the institution to legal liability. Now ask yourself this: if a rumor, however unverified, introduced a hypothetical legal vulnerability related to lineage, would ignoring it be responsible? Or would it be negligent? This is why analysts keep emphasizing that the inheritance angle is not about punishment or betrayal. It's about insulation. The monarchy has been sued before, challenged before, forced to reveal documents before. And every time, it loses a little bit of its mystique, a little bit of its control. So over time, the system evolved. It became less reactive, more cautious, more layered. Which is why people who actually study royal finances aren't shocked by the idea that inheritance would be the first thing reviewed when a rumor emerges. Because inheritance is where exposure lives. Titles are symbolic. Public roles can be reassigned. Media narratives can be managed. But once money moves, it leaves a trail. And trails invite questions. So let's talk about bloodlines. Not emotionally, but legally. In many inheritance structures tied to royal families, lineage isn't just assumed. It's defined, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but always with the expectation that if challenged, it can be defended. And that defense relies on records. Birth, documentation, declarations, legal acknowledgments. Most of the time, no one ever questions these things. Until they do, and when they do, trustees and advisors don't debate whether the challenge is fair. They debate whether it is possible. Because if it's possible, preparation begins. This is where the public narrative often goes wrong. People assume that raising questions automatically means someone believes those questions are true. In legal reality, it means someone believes the questions could be asked in court. And courts don't care about feelings. They care about standing. They care about whether trustees acted prudently once potential issues became foreseeable. So imagine the scenario being quietly discussed. Not, is this rumor true? But, could this rumor ever become a legal argument? If the answer is yes, even hypothetically, safeguards activate. This is why the idea of a temporary inheritance pause makes structural sense, even if the rumor itself is false. Because pausing does not admit wrongdoing. It prevents irreversible action. And this is the part that rarely gets discussed publicly. Royal inheritance frameworks often include clauses that allow for review if circumstances arise which could materially affect the administration of the trust. That phrase is intentionally vague. It doesn't say proof. It doesn't say conviction. It doesn't even say allegation. It says circumstances. And circumstances include public controversy that could later escalate, which means a rumor doesn't need to be true to matter. It only needs to exist. This is where the emotional tragedy of the situation collides with institutional logic. Because from the outside, it looks cold. Cruel, even. Why would a family treat one of its own this way over a rumor? But from the inside, it looks like standard operating procedure. And that difference in perspective is what makes this story so combustible. Now let's add another layer. Timing. Inheritance arrangements often include age thresholds, milestone triggers, or periodic reviews. If a review window coincided with the emergence of this rumor, the optics would be disastrous. Even if the review was routine, suddenly, a procedural check looks like a reaction, and reactions invite narratives, which invites speculation, which invites exactly the kind of attention the monarchy despises. This is why some analysts believe the palace's greatest fear right now isn't the rumor itself, it's escalation. Because escalation leads to discovery, and discovery leads to disclosures. Even if those disclosures ultimately prove nothing, the process alone is damaging. This is why silence becomes strategy, why nothing is denied, why nothing is confirmed, why everything slows down. Because speed creates mistakes. And mistakes create precedent. And precedent is permanent. Here's another uncomfortable fact. Royal inheritance structures are designed to protect the crown first, individuals second. That's not cruelty, that's architecture. The system was never meant to be fair in a modern sense. It was meant to be durable, which means that when personal circumstances intersect with institutional vulnerability, the institution always wins. And that's why this chapter matters so much, because once you understand how inheritance really works, the emotional framing changes. This isn't about one brother freezing another out. It's about a system doing exactly what it was built to do when uncertainty enters the equation. But that doesn't make it painless. And it doesn't mean it doesn't fracture relationships, because even if the decision, hypothetical or real, is framed as temporary, reversible, and procedural, the message it sends is permanent. It says, trust is conditional. And once trust becomes conditional, nothing feels secure anymore. Now let's connect this back to the rumor itself. If the allegation had targeted reputation alone, it might have been ignored. If it had targeted behavior, it might have been deflected. But it targeted something far more sensitive: lineage. And lineage is the backbone of monarchy, which means even hypothetical uncertainty strikes at the core. This is why commentators keep saying that this story isn't about whether Archie is or isn't biologically related to Prince Harry. It's about what happens when that question exists at all. Because the monarchy cannot afford unanswered questions about bloodlines. Not now, not ever. And that leads us to the next, even more unsettling layer. Because inheritance rules don't just protect assets, they create obligations. Obligations to act. Once trustees or advisors are alerted to potential risk, doing nothing becomes a choice, and choices can be judged, which raises a chilling possibility. What if the palace's silence isn't about waiting for truth, but about limiting how much of the process ever becomes visible? Because if this escalates, the story won't unfold in headlines. It will unfold in documents, and documents don't care about narrative control. They care about compliance. Which means the next phase of this story wouldn't involve statements or interviews. It would involve lawyers. And once lawyers take over, the tone changes completely. Everything becomes cautious. Everything becomes deliberate. Everything becomes recorded. And that's when even rumors begin to harden into risks. So the real takeaway from this chapter is not that inheritance rules are cruel or heartless. It's that they were built for moments exactly like this. Moments when uncertainty threatens stability. Moments when acting early is safer than explaining later. And moments when silence, however painful, is chosen over chaos. But here's the part that changes everything. Because if inheritance rules are this strict, if lineage questions are this sensitive, if the system responds this quickly to mere speculation, then the question becomes unavoidable. Why did this rumor surface now? Why this allegation at this moment in this climate? Because systems don't react in a vacuum. They react when multiple pressures collide. And according to some observers, this rumor may not be the cause of the reaction. It may be the catalyst. And catalysts don't create reactions on their own. They accelerate reactions already waiting to happen, which means the next chapter isn't about inheritance at all. It's about where the rumor came from, who benefited from its spreading, and why some secrets, once whispered, refuse to stay quiet. Because if this story were truly random, it would already be fading. Instead, it's intensifying, and that suggests something else is moving beneath the surface. Something that hasn't been named yet. Something that hasn't been exposed yet. And once that emerges, this story stops being about rules and starts being about origins. What if the most destabilizing force in this entire saga isn't proof, but the possibility of proof? Because that's where the story turns from rumor into something far more unsettling. Not a document, not a report, not a result, but the idea that verification could exist at all. In most families, DNA is personal, private, medical, emotional. In royal systems, DNA is something else entirely. It's evidence. And evidence, once invoked, even hypothetically, changes how institutions behave. Let's be very precise here. There is no publicly released DNA test, no confirmation of any biological dispute, no statement from any medical or legal authority suggesting otherwise. But according to legal analysts and royal observers, the danger was never in a result being revealed. The danger was in the question becoming formalized, because the moment a DNA question enters an institutional context, it stops being gossip. It becomes a risk vector. And risk vectors demand response. This is why people who understand palace dynamics say the phrase DNA question alone would have sent alarms through legal and advisory channels, not because anyone believed the rumor, but because of what acknowledging it could unlock. Ask yourself this: if a claim exists, any claim, that could theoretically be tested, what happens if someone demands that test? What happens if a future legal challenge argues that trustees failed to pursue clarity when doubt emerged? What happens if silence is reframed as avoidance? Suddenly, doing nothing is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision, and decisions can be interrogated. This is where the DNA issue becomes uniquely terrifying to the monarchy, because unlike behavior, relationships, or reputational controversies, DNA is binary. It's verifiable, and even when no test has been conducted, the possibility that one could be demanded creates pressure to preemptively control the environment. This is why analysts believe the palace's greatest fear isn't exposure, it's precedent. If a DNA question is entertained once, even hypothetically, it establishes that lineage can be scrutinized publicly, and that door, once opened, is nearly impossible to close. Royal history is filled with whispered doubts about heirs, legitimacy, and succession. But most of those doubts lived in rumor precisely because there was no mechanism to resolve them definitively. DNA changes that. It replaces uncertainty with science. And science doesn't respect tradition. So imagine the internal calculus. Not emotional, not accusatory, but defensive. If this rumor escalates, do we deny it? If we deny it, do we invite calls for proof? If we provide proof, do we normalize DNA verification for royal lineage? If we refuse proof, do we look evasive? Every path carries cost. And the cost of normalization may be the highest of all. Because once DNA becomes part of royal verification, it doesn't stop with one child. It becomes a standard. And standards invite scrutiny. This is why observers say the palace's silence is not confusion. It's containment. The institution understands something the public rarely does. Some questions are more dangerous than accusations, because accusations can be dismissed. Questions linger. Now consider how this rumor was framed. Not as a demand, not as a legal challenge, but as something already settled. That framing matters, because it forces institutions into a corner. If you deny too forcefully, you elevate the claim. If you ignore it, you appear indifferent. If you investigate, you validate the premise. There is no clean exit. And that's why people believe the palace's response, whatever it may be privately, is designed to keep the question from becoming actionable. Because once it becomes actionable, control shifts from palace advisors to external actors, from tradition to process, from narrative to evidence. And that's where monarchy loses its greatest advantage. Now let's talk about how DNA verification would even enter this conversation hypothetically. Not through tabloids, not through social media, but through legal logic. In inheritance disputes, even speculative ones, questions about biological relationship can be raised if lineage is relevant to eligibility. And while such challenges are rare, their mere plausibility can force trustees to consider defensive steps. Again, this is not about believing a claim. It's about anticipating a scenario, because institutions are not judged on whether rumors are true. They are judged on whether they acted prudently once risks were foreseeable. This is why some legal analysts believe that if the palace did move quietly to review inheritance arrangements, the trigger wasn't emotion. It was foresight. But here's where the human cost resurfaces. Because even hypothetical DNA scrutiny carries an emotional weight that no legal framework can soften. The idea that a child's legitimacy could be questioned publicly is devastating, not just to parents, but to the child's future. And that's where this story becomes darker. Because while the institution seeks certainty, Children become collateral in narratives they never chose. This is why the monarchy historically avoided scientific verification. Not because it feared truth, but because it feared destabilization. Because science doesn't contextualize. It doesn't offer discretion. It answers the question asked and nothing else. And that's not how monarchies survive. They survive on ambiguity, on symbolic continuity, on stories that don't require footnotes. Which is why DNA represents a kind of existential threat. Not because it reveals something new, but because it removes uncertainty in a system that depends on managed uncertainty. Now consider the timing again. Why would this rumor emerge now? Why would it frame DNA as already confirmed rather than merely speculated? Some analysts believe that framing was intentional, because claims that appear settled are harder to ignore than claims that appear hypothetical. They force response, they demand clarification. And clarification, once attempted, can backfire. This is why the palace's fear isn't that people believe the rumor. It's that someone uses the rumor as leverage. Leverage to demand answers. Leverage to force disclosure. Leverage to compel institutional response. Because once that happens, the monarchy no longer controls the timeline or the terms. Now let's address the uncomfortable contradiction at the heart of this story. On one hand, the monarchy presents itself as modern, transparent, and evolving. On the other hand, its survival mechanisms remain deeply traditional and opaque. DNA challenges expose that contradiction brutally, because you cannot be fully modern without accepting modern verification, and you cannot preserve traditional mystique if you do. So the institution stands frozen between two worlds, and freezing is exactly what it knows how to do best. Freeze response. Freeze assets. Freeze narrative. Buy time. Because time is the only thing that can diffuse a question without answering it. But time only works if the question stops spreading. And that's where this story takes another turn. Because according to media analysts, the DNA rumor didn't just spread randomly. It moved through channels that suggest amplification, repetition, coordination, escalation. And that raises a new question entirely. What if the DNA claim isn't the threat? What if it's the tool? Because tools are used with intention, and intentions point to actors, which brings us to the next chapter. Because once you accept that the DNA question terrified the palace not because of truth, but because of consequence, you have to ask where it came from, who benefited, and why some rumors are allowed to die quietly, while others are fed oxygen until institutions start moving in the dark. Because if this rumor forced the palace into contingency mode, then someone succeeded. And that success may not have been accidental. What happens when a rumor stops being about science and starts being about narrative? Because this is where the conversation shifted. Quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, then all at once. The DNA speculation didn't stay confined to legal hypotheticals or institutional anxiety. It began pulling other threads into the open, threads that had been tucked away, ignored, or deliberately sealed off for years. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about lineage, it was about history. Not documented history, not court records or verified timelines, but narrative history. The stories people tell, the assumptions people make, the contradictions people circle back to when a new allegation gives them permission to look again. This is the moment where Meghan Markle's past, not as fact, but as a media construct, re-entered the conversation with force. And before we go any further, let's be clear. There is no new evidence, no newly released documents, no verified revelations. What resurfaced were questions, old questions, unresolved questions, questions that had never been proven, but never fully extinguished either. And once the DNA rumor began circulating, those questions found a new frame. Because rumors don't travel alone. They gather context, they borrow from existing narratives, and they become more believable not through proof, but through familiarity. This is how reputational storms form, not from one explosive revelation, but from layers of speculation stacking on top of one another until the weight feels overwhelming. For Meghan Markle, that stacking effect is not new. From the moment she entered the royal sphere, her life became a battleground between competing stories: who she was before the monarchy, what she represented to it, what she challenged by simply existing within it. Supporters saw modernity, independence, disruption of outdated norms. Critics saw opacity, ambition, unanswered questions. And the palace, caught between these narratives, did what it often does best. It said very little, which worked, until it didn't. Because when a new rumor touches something as sensitive as DNA, people instinctively look backward. They search for patterns. They revisit old interviews, timelines, photographs, anecdotes, not because those things prove anything, but because they create a sense of coherence. And coherence feels like truth. This is why analysts say the DNA speculation didn't create a new narrative. It activated an old one, a narrative that had been dormant, not resolved. So what exactly resurfaced? Not specifics, not accusations, but insinuations. Questions about privacy, questions about transparency, questions about how much the public was ever meant to know. And this is where the story becomes deeply unfair and deeply human. Because living under permanent scrutiny means that even innocence doesn't feel safe. Every silence becomes strategic. Every boundary becomes suspicious. Every refusal to engage becomes, what are they hiding? This is the paradox Meghan has lived in for years. Demanded to be open, punished for being private, asked to prove herself repeatedly in ways no one else is. So when the DNA rumor emerged, it didn't need new fuel, it ignited existing embers. And suddenly, commentators weren't asking whether the claim was true. They were asking why it sounded plausible to some people. And that question is far more dangerous, because plausibility doesn't come from evidence. It comes from narrative conditioning, from years of framing a person as controversial, opaque, or divisive. Once that frame exists, any rumor slots neatly into place. Which is why this chapter matters, because the palace's fear was never about Meghan's past in any factual sense. It was about how quickly her narrative could be weaponized again, because narratives don't need proof to spread. They need resonance. And this one resonated, not because of DNA, but because of unresolved public tension. Now consider how this looks from inside the institution. An unverified claim emerges. It touches lineage. It escalates to inheritance hypotheticals. And then suddenly, the conversation broadens. Not in official channels, but in public discourse, Meghan's history is being reinterpreted. Her privacy choices are reframed as concealment. Her silence is cast as strategy. And none of it requires validation to feel consequential. Because once the story moves from, is this true, to, why does this feel familiar, damage accelerates. This is why some observers believe the palace's concern is less about the rumor itself and more about how it reopens a narrative they thought had stabilized. Because stabilized narratives are manageable, reactivated ones are not. This is also where emotional stakes spike. Because for Meghan, this isn't just institutional anxiety. It's personal. Imagine watching a hypothetical allegation, one you didn't create, didn't validate, didn't engage with, suddenly reframe your entire life story again. Not with new information, but with old assumptions that were never proven, but never forgotten. That kind of scrutiny doesn't just hurt reputations, it erodes trust, not just in institutions, but in people. And here's the irony. The more Meghan retreats from public response, the more speculation fills the void. But responding risks legitimizing the premise. It's a trap with no safe exit, and the palace knows this, which is why, according to analysts, internal discussions likely focused less on Meghan as an individual and more on the reputational contagion effect. Because once a narrative becomes contagious, it spreads beyond its origin. It infects associated figures, children, families, institutions, and children, especially, cannot be defended publicly without exposing them further. So silence becomes the least damaging option. But silence doesn't stop escalation. It only slows it, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the resurgence of Meghan's past, again as narrative not fact, was not incidental? What if it was predictable? Because narratives don't resurface randomly. They resurface when they are useful. and usefulness implies motive. Now, to be very careful, this does not mean anyone orchestrated the rumor. It means the ecosystem was primed for it, primed by years of polarized coverage, primed by unresolved tensions, primed by an audience trained to read between lines that may not exist. In such an environment, any spark can look like fire. And that's why the palace's alleged concern wasn't limited to DNA or inheritance. It was about reputational collapse, because once a person's past becomes open season again, every future decision is interpreted through that lens, including legal safeguards, including silence, including caution, which leads to a brutal feedback loop. The palace stays quiet to avoid escalation. The public interprets quiet as confirmation. Speculation intensifies. Safeguards tighten, and suddenly, rumor appears to drive reality, even when it doesn't. This is why the next phase of the story becomes so critical, because when narratives resurface, institutions look for sources, not to punish, but to understand flow. Who started it? Who amplified it? Who benefited? Because benefit reveals intention, and intention reveals threat. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because if Meghan's past resurfaced as narrative fuel rather than factual discovery, then the real danger isn't what people are saying, it's who is listening and what they're preparing to do with it. Because once stories gain momentum, they attract actors who know how to turn attention into leverage. And leverage is where rumors become tools that can reshape outcomes far beyond their origin. So the question now isn't whether the narrative is fair, it's whether it's being used. And if it is, then the next move won't come from the palace. It will come from outside it. And when that happens, this story enters an entirely new phase. What happens when a child becomes the center of a question he never asked to answer? Because this is where the story crosses a line most institutions desperately try not to cross. Up to this point, the conversation has lived in abstractions. Rumors, hypotheticals, legal frameworks, institutional fears. Complex, yes. Disturbing, certainly. But still distant. Then a name enters the frame. Archie. And the moment that happens, everything changes. Not because of anything he has done, not because of anything proven, but because in a monarchy, children are never just children. They are symbols. They are continuity. They are futures imagined long before they can speak. And that is precisely why this chapter is the most sensitive of all. Because even discussing a bloodline problem feels wrong when it involves a child. And yet, in royal history, children have often been the focal point of the most brutal institutional calculations. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Let's slow down and be careful here. There is no official dispute about Archie's status, no public challenge, no legal filing, no confirmation of any kind, but the rumor didn't need to reach that level to trigger concern, because once lineage is invoked, even hypothetically, the system reacts automatically. And the system doesn't differentiate between adults and children when it comes to structural implications. That's the part most people struggle to accept. In everyday life, a child is protected from adult conflict. In monarchies, children inherit adult consequences. This is why analysts say the Archie problem, as some have coldly labeled it, isn't about him personally. It's about what he represents within a rigid, bloodline-based framework. Because royal systems are built on assumptions of continuity, and continuity rests on one core idea. That lineage is unquestionable. The moment lineage becomes questionable, even in rumor, the system begins stress testing itself. Not publicly, not emotionally, but mechanically. So what does that stress test look like? It begins with mapping implications. If the rumor were ever escalated, not proven, just escalated, what could it affect? Line of succession narratives, eligibility for certain trust benefits, symbolic representation of the future monarchy. Not immediately, not necessarily, but eventually. And institutions don't wait for eventually to arrive. They plan for it. This is where the emotional discomfort deepens. Because from a human perspective, Archie is a child growing up far from palace walls, largely shielded from royal life. From an institutional perspective, he is still connected to the architecture of monarchy, whether he participates or not. And architecture doesn't forget connections. So when the rumor framed DNA as already confirmed, again unverified, unsupported, it did something subtle but powerful. It collapsed the distance between abstract speculation and a specific individual. And once that happens, the system doesn't ask whether it's fair, it asks whether it's dangerous. This is why legal analysts emphasize that institutions respond not to moral outrage, but to exposure. If a narrative exists that could one day be weaponized against the monarchy, even unfairly, it must be neutralized or contained. And children, tragically, are often where such narratives aim. Because children are emotionally untouchable but structurally critical. Now consider how this plays out psychologically. The public hears a rumor and reacts emotionally. Outrage, defensiveness, sympathy. The institution hears the same rumor and reacts procedurally. Risk assessment, scenario modeling, safeguard activation. These two reactions don't speak the same language, which is why the public often misinterprets institutional silence as cruelty. But from inside the system, silence is not indifference. It's restraint. Because once the institution speaks about a child in response to rumor, it validates the premise. And validation is irreversible. So instead, everything shifts inward. Quiet reviews, internal discussions, legal hypotheticals, all designed to avoid one thing above all else: a precedent where a child's lineage becomes a matter of public adjudication. Because that would be catastrophic, not just for this generation, but for the monarchy itself. This is where historical context matters. Royal history is filled with examples of children whose legitimacy was questioned, whispered about, or contested. Those whispers rarely ended well. They destabilized reigns, they fueled power struggles, they justified cruelty under the guise of order. Modern monarchies learned from that history. They learned that uncertainty about children must be contained early, not debated openly. And that containment doesn't look compassionate from the outside. It looks cold. But cold systems survive. Now ask yourself this. If you were tasked with protecting an institution that has survived for centuries, would you allow a rumor, however baseless, to grow unchecked around a child connected to its future? Or would you quietly reinforce boundaries to ensure that no irreversible steps were taken while uncertainty existed? This is where the alleged inheritance review becomes relevant again. Because inheritance is one of the few levers the institution can adjust without public explanation. It doesn't involve the child directly. It doesn't involve statements about lineage, it simply preserves optionality. And optionality is everything in moments like this. But here's the part that unsettles even seasoned observers. Once a child becomes part of an institutional risk assessment, the emotional damage is already done. Even if nothing ever happens, even if the rumor fades, even if the truth never matters, the awareness that the system is capable of such calculation changes relationships forever. Because trust, once questioned, doesn't return easily. And that may be the quiet tragedy unfolding beneath the headlines. A family already fractured, now navigating the knowledge that their child's identity, however unfairly, became part of a risk scenario. That kind of realization lingers. Now let's address the contradiction that fuels public outrage. On one hand, the monarchy promotes itself as modern, compassionate, family-oriented. On the other hand, its foundational logic remains archaic: bloodlines, legitimacy, continuity. These two identities coexist uneasily, and moments like this expose the tension. Because modern audiences recoil at the idea of children being subjected to institutional scrutiny. But monarchies were never designed for modern sensibilities. They were designed for endurance, and endurance demands sacrifice, often by those with the least power. This is not unique to Archie. It is a pattern as old as monarchy itself, which makes this chapter particularly uncomfortable, because recognizing that truth doesn't make it acceptable. It just makes it visible. Now consider how this affects the narrative going forward. Once Archie is framed, however unfairly, as a problem, even in speculative discourse, every future story is colored by that frame. His absence from royal life becomes suspicious. His privacy becomes strategic. His distance becomes symbolic. None of this is fair, but fairness is not the metric institutions use. They use stability, and stability often demands silence. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. Because if this rumor fades, the system resets quietly and nothing changes publicly. But if it escalates, through repetition, amplification, or opportunistic actors, the consequences deepen. Not because of truth, but because of momentum. And momentum is dangerous. This is why the palace's alleged anxiety isn't really about Archie's identity. It's about protecting him from becoming a battlefield. Because once a child becomes symbolic, they lose their right to be ordinary. And that is something the monarchy, despite its cold logic, understands all too well. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because the moment a child enters the narrative, emotional stakes skyrocket. And emotional stakes don't just affect families, they affect individuals under pressure. Individuals like Prince Harry, a man already caught between identity, loyalty, and distance. A man who may now feel that the system he walked away from has followed him anyway. Because when institutions move quietly, the shock is not in the action. It's in the realization that escape was never complete. And that realization changes everything. What happens when your life, the life you've tried to rebuild, suddenly feels as fragile as glass? This is where rumor, narrative, and institutional anxiety collide, in a way that even seasoned observers describe as seismic. For Prince Harry, the emergence of speculation surrounding lineage, inheritance, and narrative scrutiny isn't just a headline, it's a potential psychological earthquake. Now, to be absolutely clear, nothing has been officially confirmed. There are no legal filings, no public announcements, and no evidence that any child or adult has been implicated. Everything that follows is based on analysis of how institutions operate, media coverage, and the patterns these observers recognize. But that doesn't make the potential impact any less dramatic. Harry's life, since stepping back from royal duties, has been carefully constructed. He has attempted to carve out independence from the monarchy while maintaining a public presence, philanthropic work, and a semblance of personal privacy. Every move he makes is scrutinized, every interview dissected, every social media post amplified. It is a life in which visibility and discretion are constantly in tension. Imagine, then, the emergence of a rumor like this. A claim suggesting that his child, and by extension, his familial and institutional identity, might be subject to institutional review or public questioning. Even unverified, even hypothetical, it introduces a new kind of uncertainty. Analysts suggest that the effect is immediate. Suddenly, Harry is no longer operating in a private sphere. He's being assessed, indirectly, institutionally, as a potential risk to the very system he walked away from. And risk, in institutional terms, demands action. This isn't about emotion, at least not yet. It's about potential exposure. Inheritance rules, legal safeguards, and lineage contingencies are triggered not by guilt or innocence, but by the plausible scenario of challenge. And when plausible scenarios arise, the actors involved, trustees, advisors, even family members, respond swiftly and quietly. But for Harry, this response is personal. It is emotional, because the mechanisms of protection that the institution deploys aren't designed to reassure him. They are designed to safeguard continuity. They are indifferent to feelings, and the realization that his child could be considered part of a hypothetical review, however unfair, is destabilizing. Observers describe this as a dual collapse. One level is public and narrative-based. Headlines speculate. Social media amplifies. Public opinion fractures. The other level is private and psychological. Even if no action has been taken against him, Harry perceives the weight of scrutiny. The sense that the system he sought to distance himself from has not released its grip is profoundly unsettling. We can imagine the internal conflict. On one hand, he has distanced himself from institutional control, seeking autonomy for his family. On the other hand, the shadow of lineage and inherited responsibility looms large. Every rumor threatens not just public perception, but the imagined security he has painstakingly constructed for his loved ones. It is in moments like this that the interplay of rumor, legal logic, and emotional consequence becomes most acute because the institution's actions, pause, review, quiet consultation, are invisible to the public. They leave no trace in headlines or press releases, but they are felt intensely by those at the center of the narrative. The effect is isolating. Observers note that when individuals face institutional scrutiny indirectly through rumor, narrative, or hypothetical scenario, the emotional toll is comparable to direct confrontation. Anxiety spikes, trust erodes, relationships strain, and in Harry's case, he must navigate this while also protecting his children and spouse from potential fallout. Analysts suggest that this layered tension is compounded by history. Previous controversies involving the monarchy have shown that even unverified allegations can shape perception for decades. For Harry, whose life has been under continuous public attention, the emergence of this DNA rumor interacts with a broader context of scrutiny, framing, and narrative expectation. And here's a crucial point. The collapse isn't just personal. It's relational. Reports and speculation indicate that family dynamics, particularly between Harry and William, could be strained further not because of direct action, but because of the institutional imperatives that each party represents. William, as an institutional actor, must prioritize continuity. Harry, as a private individual, must prioritize protection. The intersection of these priorities creates tension that observers describe as inevitable. So the psychological effect is twofold. One, the individual experiences a sense of destabilization, questioning whether their autonomy and family privacy can withstand public and institutional pressure. Two, relational trust is challenged. Even if no ill will exists, the perception of institutional or familial judgment can create emotional distance. And yet, observers caution against oversimplification. Harry's response, if measured, demonstrates an acute awareness of the stakes. The fact that he maintains public composure while dealing with these pressures suggests strategic resilience. But resilience doesn't eliminate the underlying tension. It only contains it. Which is why analysts are so focused on the domino effect. Once uncertainty touches lineage or inheritance, even hypothetically, it ripples outward. Each decision the institution takes to protect continuity, whether reviewing a trust, adjusting provisions, or simply pausing action, is interpreted through a lens of personal consequence. And for Harry, these indirect actions carry the weight of direct confrontation. Furthermore, the narrative surrounding the child and family is particularly potent because it intersects with societal expectations. Public perception equates lineage with legitimacy, and legitimacy with moral authority. Even in the absence of factual evidence, the framing of the rumor interacts with these assumptions.